Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm acutely aware that I'm speaking to two audiences today. Those of you who are masked before me, of course, but also the YouTube audience that'll be interested in this talk in the days and years to come. And that audience will include a number of my colleagues, scholars of masculinity, many, perhaps most, from a feminist orientation, and some not. I am keenly aware that what I say today will please no one. Neither of those two audiences will be thoroughly pleased with me, and perhaps that'll mean I've done my job quite well. But what I'm hoping to do is bring a new way of thinking about gender equality to both groups. And no better way could I do that than to come to speak to this group, which has already caught the attention of the other group. So, before I begin about how I moved away from feminism into a more social scientific perspective on the study of masculinities, let me first tell you how I became a scholar in the first place. And to do this, I'm going to take a bit of an old feminist thing of that the personal is political, and give you just a little bit of my background journey because it helps explain how I got into the field and where I come from in that capacity. So, in 1993, I came out of the closet as America's first openly gay high school coach. And the experience was absolutely horrific, riddled with homophobic violence, particularly from team sport athletes. In wanting to make sense of that experience, I sought the PhD. And of course, growing up in Southern California, there was no better person to seek tutelage from than Michael Messner, who was the expert on sport and its relationship to masculinities. Michael Messner was correct. Michael Messner was right about what he had to say about masculinities. The problem that I began to realize with Messner is he was right for a particular domain of time. He was right about the relationship between sport and masculinities for the early to mid-1980s, but that the culture had changed and his data and his perceptions of men had not. After doing my PhD, I did a postdoc with Michael Kimmel, who is less interested in sport and more interested in gender politics more fully. And Michael Kimmel also taught me a little bit of the showmanship that I have as a presenter. And I'm very well aware that these two Michaels will infuriate many of you. Yes. I am here to say that perhaps we should have a more balanced perspective on who infuriates who. I do not agree with much of what Michael Kimmel says, for example. But we agree on some. And we are friends, and we will remain friends, hopefully, even after this video circulates, despite having differences. Because that is the way academy works. Thesis, antithesis, new resolution. Thesis, antithesis, new resolution. Without the thesis or the antithesis, there is no new resolution. And in culture, which is always changing, there must always be some form of new resolution. Well, the principal way that I began to move away from my pro-feminist orientation that I published under and worked under for years was data-driven. The research on men and masculinities, and particularly in sport, portrayed team sport athletes as being horrifically homophobic, unemotional, violent creatures. But what my research was showing was that young men were moving away from this disposition. And this is led principally by decreasing cultural homophobia. All national surveys show that the project of the millennial youth has been the massive, rapid decrement of antipathy towards homosexuality. And in a culture in which one is afraid to be thought gay, but unable to prove their heterosexuality, which is all heterosexual males, homophobia serves as a policing weapon of gender. You want your friends to think you're straight. You can't prove you're straight, so you act in hyper-macho ways to socially prove you're straight and that lasts for a little bit of time. The purpose of homophobia and anti-feminine attitudes was to say, I'm not gay. But as homophobia has dropped, as it's no longer homosexuality that's stigmatized, but homophobia which is stigmatized, youth began to take a different perspective on gender. They began to celebrate all of the things that feminists have wanted men to be, and masculinity scholars had said men were not. They started to be more emotional with each other, more honest about their emotions. They started to be more egalitarian in their relationships. They started to have gay friends. They started to develop bromances, very intimate relationships between other men. They even began a great deal of physical tactility between each other. In my research on the United Kingdom on team sport athletes, over 90% have cuddled with another male. Now, you might find this preposterous. You may not. But this is what the millennial youth are about. Love of each other, and that includes a great deal of physical tactility. A lot of people didn't believe me when my research showed that in the United Kingdom, 89% of heterosexual male undergraduates had kissed another male on the lips, in a culture in which there has never been a history of this occurring. But it has been replicated. It's been shown to be 10% across the United States, with 40% of males kissing on the cheeks, and 30% in Australia. This is the project of masculinity for millennial youth. It is completely and totally different than my father's masculinity or my masculinity. It is a new, softer, inclusive form of masculinity, and that trend is not going away. So I want you to look at some YouGov data here with me. Over here is when we ask men, do you identify as completely masculine or completely feminine? In 2016, men who are 65 and older almost exclusively said they were completely masculine or close to it. But watch what happens with the next cohort of men. Men who are 50 to 64 have a statistically remarkable difference in their willingness to affiliate with complete masculinity. Men who are 25 to 49, again, we're losing the complete masculine, and we're rising over here in the middle. Watch what happens with millennial youth, who, by the way, I see probably maybe one or two of in this room. Obviously, that's because of the cost, but perhaps you could talk to them at break if you don't believe me. Boom. There is a rejection of the completely masculine in total. We are seeing the same thing with heterosexuality. We are seeing a growing percentage of young straight men identifying as mostly straight and not exclusively straight. Millennials are opposed to identity category. They're opposed to hypermasculinity. They're opposed to pigeonholing sexualities. This is all changing. Now, at least you think, well, maybe these are just YouGov folks, right? And maybe they're a particular type of person that subscribes to these surveys. Here's some data that is collected just a few months ago on British rugby players and football players. And it almost shows the same thing. Slightly more masculine, perhaps because they play incredibly violent sports, but still, this acceptance, the mode, is far from completely masculine. So that is the future of masculinity, and that is not going to change. And that means that young straight men have become everything, most things, that feminists have wanted them to be. Now, shouldn't that bring feminists and the MRA community closer together? Well, the study of masculinities is formalized within the domain of education, particularly within sociology and women's studies programs, has recently been described in a journal article published in the journal Men and Masculinity. And that journal is edited by Michael Kimmel. He is the gatekeeper of this academic world. But he has allowed this article to be published. And in this article, they say that the first wave of academic scholarship really emerged with second-wave feminism It emerged with people like Michael Messner, but sort of a dislocated, atheoretical emergence looking at men and their relationship to women in sport and fraternities and other masculine organizations. And the second wave is considered to be Kimmelian, which is this notion of hegemonic masculinity. Now, I'm not going to get into the theory of what hegemonic masculinity is, but what you need to know is that this is what all masculinity scholars were doing until I came around. Almost all. And what this theory says that there is a relationship between different types of masculinity, from sort of like the hyper macho on top to the gay men so far down subordinated that, Connell didn't even consider them masculine in her first version of this work. And the second part of Connell's theory was absolute utter rubbish. And it was concerning patriarchy. And somehow this social stratification of men was supposed to be what reproduces patriarchy. Well, no masculinity scholar could ever empirically show that there was any truth to that whatsoever. It was a foolish errand. And masculinity scholars have begun to realize that, which is why there's been such uptake in my theory, inclusive masculinity theory. And that is because inclusive masculinity theory says that the inner stratification of men is related to cultural homophobia. And as homophobia dies, the stratification of hierarchy of masculinities also dies. And that there's more there's more lore for various types of masculinities. And what my research shows is for a young man to be popular, he needs to have friends in multiple groups of types of men. They need to be genuine in their performance of masculinity. And published in Michael Kimmel's journal is this article that says the third wave of masculinity studies is Andersonian, which I quite got a kick out of. Andersonian? That's me with my hair dyed. I'm recently publishing a book called Men and Masculinity. It will be the first that I know of non-feminist academic textbook for intro-level sociology, gender studies, masculinity studies. And I wrote the book from a data-driven perspective, all right, free of ideology. I wrote the book, and in the process of writing that book, I shamefully discovered all sorts of issues that I, a professor of masculinity, had never encountered before. Most of those on that list. And I was and am angry because I was lied to, because select information was withheld, because the feminist-driven orientation of the discipline only permits certain topics to be discussed as important and limits the rest. Why was I not aware of these issues? Well, I really lost my temper, according to the last speaker, thank you, when I read about the gender paradox. Because not only had I been withheld this knowledge by the collective of my community, but because if you go to Google Scholar right now, and masculinity scholars who are watching this on YouTube, I challenge you to do this. Go to Google Scholar right now, Google the gender paradox, and see how much academic work you find on it, and how much of that comes from masculinity scholars. And the answer is goose egg. To be denied knowledge of the existence of what happens when the feminist mantra actually plays out in multiple Nordic countries, to be denied the knowledge that when we grow into a culture that absolutely encourages women to go into STEM, that they have higher rates of occupational gender segregation than in cultures that discourage women to go into STEM. The tertiary variable here, by the way, is medium income. But how are we not talking about this? Because what this tells me is that the feminist project is misguided to achieve financial equity, to achieve parity in occupational segregation, another strategy would be required, if possible at all. Right? So basically what you have here are countries that are highly gender equitable and that have social policies designed to get women to go into STEM. And down here you have countries that do not. But what you find is there are more women present in STEM, down here means 40%, than there are in the countries where they thoroughly encourage this to happen. It is absolutely ironic. Now, it is only a paradox if you think that gender is entirely socially constructed. If, like psychologist David Schmidt, you believe that gender is a representation of internal interests, then what happens in these countries is women make enough money, maybe even equal money to men working in the STEM fields, and they therefore have freedom to choose what fields they want to go into, because they are not basing their decisions on financial decisions, they are basing it on interest. And in these countries, like Algeria and Turkey and Tunisia, women will pursue fields that they may not be interested in because they have higher financial incentive. This is not present in any masculinity textbook. It's not present in any gender textbook that I know of. That is a willful act, a violent, willful act of academic exclusion. The problem with academic feminism is they are all beating the same drum. Because if you don't beat the same drum in the line of work that I am, you run into resistance, serious resistance. There are gatekeepers that will prevent your papers from being published, which prevents you from being hired, which prevents you from having promotion, which prevents you from making a decent living off of the years you spent earning that PhD. What are you going to do when the gun is to your head? Walk the line, or the 7 years you spent earning your PhD, poof. I didn't walk the line. And I believe that the door has been opened for masculinity scholars to walk away from feminism and take a new perspective. And I believe that based on evidence, the fact that my theory is largely, is growing very rapidly with a very large number of citations. But I also believe it's because feminism is destroying itself. Because feminism has become like patriarchy, this nebulous concept of how do you define it? What is it? How can you understand feminism when you have pro-sex work feminists and anti-sex work feminists? How can you understand feminism when you have pro-trans feminists and radical exclusionary TERF feminists? How can you understand feminism when they've got, pro-pornography and anti-pornography? When you have Christina Hoff Sommers and Michael Kimmel both identifying as the same label, how are you supposed to understand feminism? Next, there is a lot of violence in the feminist academy. This violence may not be physical, but it is exclusionary. But I don't want you to try to read this quote by the most adhered to, esteemed feminist scholar, Judith Butler. I don't want you to read this quote and think, wow, she must be really smart because she understands that. That the power regimes of heterosexism and phallocentrism seek to augment themselves through a constant repetition of their logic, their metaphysic, and their naturalized ontologies does not imply, I'm out of breath, does not imply that repetition itself ought to be stopped as if it could be. The hell does that mean? If you pick up this, one of the most cited books in the entirety of social sciences and humanities, every paragraph is like this. It's nonsensical. This is not science. She's a philosopher. If you ask me, it's not even good philosophy. Certainly not as good as what Goffman had done before her. But the intolerance is rising. This is the editor of the #1 academic journal for feminist study of gender called Signs. She is the gatekeeper. And she published about a month or two ago in the Washington Post an opinion piece in which she says to men, if you really are with us and would like us not to hate you for all of the millennia of woe you have produced and benefited from, start from this. Pledge to vote for feminist women only. Don't run for office. Don't be in charge of anything. Step away from the power. We got this. And please know that your crocodile tears won't be wiped away by us anymore. We have every right to hate you. You have done us wrong. If any man in any academic discipline, in any university in the Anglo-American world had said even a tenth of that, they would have lost their job. There is no outrage, there is no petition for that hate speech. That is violence, and it is condoned by the Feminist Academy. Finally, feminism is tearing itself apart through all of this ridiculous, over-the-top social justice warrior type of stuff. And a lot of this maybe started in a good place. Like maybe it started with more serious issues like, you know what, maybe it's not a good idea to name your baseball team after a Native American tribe and have people pretending to chop people's heads off and things like that, right? But then it goes right down to the point, you're not eating tacos, are you? Are you eating tacos? You're culturally appropriating Mexican culture. There's no platforming business. The liberal left has culturally appropriated the far right. I used to fear my conservative students in class. I now fear my liberal students in class. I'm a centrist. I'm stood in the middle going, there's some craziness on both sides here. But since when did it become a project of the left to be against free speech? Even in the academy, the one place it must prevail. Microaggressions. You know what? If you see me and my husband and my 2 children walking down the street, and you come up and say, oh, what beautiful children. Did you adopt them? And I say, no, we've made them through surrogacy and egg donation. I am not offended that you assumed I adopted them because they are not the same color as me. If you see me in the hallways and you say, hey, so you have children. Oh, is your wife here? I am not offended that you assume that I'm heterosexual. Statistically, you're more likely to be right. I am grateful that you took a moment out of your day to connect with another human being and have discourse with them and to compliment my children. When we live in a culture in which we are afraid to say to somebody, oh, where do you come from? Then we just cease to interact with people. And we walk around in our own little shell with our iPhones, afraid to interact with anybody for being culturally inappropriate. Trigger warnings. I lost my temper for trigger warnings when I went to a conference on pornography and they had trigger warnings before showing porn. Safe spaces. I can't believe I'm saying this. This hurts me to say because, I remember the 90s when the idea of safe spaces came to be. And what it meant was on faculty doors, a little rainbow flag was put to say, if you're LGBT, it was mostly LGB back then, but also LGBT, then this is a place you can be honest, you can talk to me, you're not going to be offended. And it's moved from that to, holy cow, we've got to have puppy dogs and rainbows because somebody's talking about something that you might be offended by, even at the university. And it has just gone too far. Then there's the whole raft of feminist issues that are concerned with making men, the totality of men, look bad. Mansplaining. There's another word for mansplaining that takes the whole of men's gender out of the play, and it's called patronizing. So if somebody is patronizing you, please just say, could you stop patronizing me? You don't have to say, would you please stop mansplaining to me? How about this one? Manspreading. Yes, I'm sorry on behalf of all males that on average we are 6 inches taller and therefore when we sit down, our legs are going to go to the side a bit to take up some of that extra height. unless you want to sit with your knees in your face. And how come manspreading is about men's legs and not women's baggage? And then there's the classic, the patriarchy. The patriarchy, the patriarchy. They're everywhere. It's like Ghostbusters. You know what? I would love to smash the patriarchy. If Kimmel or Messner or any feminist I've ever met ever could just show me where it is, I will be the first with my hammer to smash the patriarchy. But it exists as a nebulous, ill-definable concept that used to be used to talk about women's disadvantage, but is now used to portray men in a negative light. And that is eclipsed by the concept of toxic masculinity, which is not an academic concept, is not theoretically based, totalitizes all men as toxic, is not balanced with toxic femininity, and underplays the damage that women can cause and their own complicity in the damage that they say that men cause. Now, if you ask me, Donald Trump is a perfect example of toxic masculinity, as some of these would like to use it. Yet 53% of white women in America voted for Donald Trump. So if you want feminists, if you want to make a difference, and you believe that if you don't like that type of masculinity, then you could really start with women first, because they had a female candidate to vote for, and they didn't. That's what they say. But the point here, of course, is that whatever patriarchy might be, if it actually exists anymore, women are equally complicit in it. It is not just a man's problem. And the final thing that I think is going to help bring down feminism is the democratization of knowledge. Because it used to be that academics like Michael Kimmel held the throne. All knowledge of gender went through him, disseminated through the media. And then this little noise was invented. It kind of went... We called that dial-up. The internet has brought the democratization of knowledge to the masses. Today, Michael Kimmel's voice is powerful, but so is her voice. Today, I can tell my students something, and they are literally Googling it in class to tell me that I'm wrong, which is fantastic. That's the way it should be. No longer is knowledge and power dedicated to just the professors. I would hate to get into an argument with Karen Strawn over anything. So what this really leads me to believe is, I don't think we need antithesis to the idea of feminism. I don't think we need antipathy to feminism. I'm not in favor of a declaration, the anti-feminist declaration. That's not me. I think it's dangerous. And I don't mean dangerous like people are going to die dangerous. I don't think it helps this cause, because there are feminists here and there are MRA activists here who believe in many feminist causes. And if you say anti-feminist, you wipe them all away in one broad brush. Well, that's interesting. That got about a third of the audience's applause. Right? But you know what? That third of the audience applause is a hell of a lot higher percentage than feminists think I would get from this audience. Because their perspective of you is that you are horrific. We're going to get to that in 1 second. So what I believe is this. Look, we've had 4 waves of feminism. The first, basically loosely around women's rights to vote. I'll stand for that. The second, basically the introduction of feminism into the academy to look at women's positions in work and the family. I'll stand by that. That's what I am, a second wave feminism, or used to be. Because then this third wave came along, and this third wave was intersectional feminism. Okay, yeah, I understand race and sexuality is important and all of these things, but the language that was used to describe it was indecipherable. It was just post-structural nonsense. And then, apparently, we're into a fourth wave of feminism now, which is really best described by social justice warriors on the internet. So I do want to propose a fifth wave of feminism. I know this is not going to please this audience, but the fifth wave of feminism should be a wave goodbye. I knew you'd like that. Oh, my masculinity friends, some of them are sitting there watching this on YouTube right now just going, "Ugh." I think what both feminists and MRAs need to do is lose the either-or sides to this debate and move to becoming gender equality activists. Now, I have just returned from the feminist organization, the American Men's Studies Association. I talked to about 30 feminists in my talk there. 8 said that they broadly identify as a men's rights activist as well. And when I talk to feminists or men's rights activists, I find that there is serious agreement on more issues than there is minor agreement on some issues. That actually, when it comes to the issues, there is broad agreement. And I believe if we were to move to gender equality activists, then we would stop seeing team colors, red versus blue or black versus white. And we would have to engage with each other based on the issue at hand. Now, I suggest that this will also have a beneficial impact on the project of what we are trying to do here as an MRA community, which is promote men's lives. And I want to show you something, because I think the feminists have done a good job of beating the hell out of you. And I think you need a new strategy, because MRA is associated with violent, homophobic, racist. Could the camera please get the audience? Right? We've got genderqueer people here. We've got a guy in the back wearing a kilt. We've got a gay guy being applauded. And we've got races from all around the world. They are wrong, but they are still beating you in the domain of public discourse. Look what happened with gay marriage. We had growing slow support, and then we changed our tactics, and we took it to marriage equality. Boom. It is a lot harder to go on the radio and say, I am against marriage equality. It's hard to go against anything with the term equality in it, full stop. So imagine the next time Mike Buchanan is on the radio and they say, hi, we have with us here today Mike Buchanan, gender equality activist. Now, 95% of the radio's listening audience who knows nothing about the wars between MRA and feminism that wage on YouTube will go, oh, well, that sounds like a very pleasant thing. Who can't get behind that? I suggest that the organization consider, and again, this is not my job, I'm just making the suggestion and then I'll run away. I suggest that you take this and you make it genital mutilation, quotes, boys and girls. I suggest that you put marriage equality in the list. I suggest that you put racial equality in the list related to gender. I suggest that you put a couple of issues that are specifically domain to feminists in there, including the pay gap. Now, we all know that the pay gap statistic is absolutely absurd, and the absurdity of the pay gap statistic means it's not going to change. So what is wrong with coming out and saying, I support women's equality and reducing the gender pay gap? You guys have that discussion with yourselves. The point is a little PR change to soften the image and promote a wider audience's reception of you in a positive way, I think would do a good thing. And I have you know that I say the same thing to academic feminists, because my students are turning away from feminism because the fourth wave of feminism is scaring them away. Well, I just want you to lastly know what I'm going to do. I can't take on all these issues, but one issue that you guys have not discussed that I bring to the table is the fact that in, for example, the United Kingdom, from the age of 11, around 93% of young boys are compelled to play contact rugby against their will and occur all sorts of brain damage. That occurs both from concussion and microconcussions. This is state-sponsored child abuse, and it's mostly against boys, and this needs to end. Finally, if you want to read about this and all sorts of things from my very centrist position in the study of masculinities, the first non-feminist academic textbook, 101 style, is coming out by Routledge. That's the cover, Men and Masculinity, by myself and one of my former PhD students. Thank you very much, and I'll take all the questions you have.
Thank you. Klaus Zinser. I got stuck on your last picture with the brain because I have a discussion with a German psychologist, and he brought up if we want to demonstrate the parental alienation of a child, put this child in a computer tomograph and show pictures of both parents and see how the brain reacts. Two questions. Has this ever happened, such an analysis? But first I should ask, would it make sense?
I can't comment. It's just too far. Can you hear me? I can't comment. It's just too far from my academic knowledge. I can tell you one thing. fMRI studies are very expensive, so I absolutely doubt that this has occurred. They're about $1,500 per image. Yeah.
I just had a quick, simple question, which is the numbers that you showed up there, the very two similar curves that you showed for the masculinity graph, are those numbers 1, 2, 3? Are those numbers chosen by the subjects, or are they assigned by the researchers?
They are self-described. And in fact, I'll tell you exactly what they say that I couldn't put up there. It says completely masculine, mostly masculine, somewhat masculine, equally masculine, feminine, mostly, you know, get the idea, and goes the other side to totally feminine. So these men who are describing themselves as 3 are saying slightly more masculine than feminine. And a lot of these men, including the athletes, are describing themselves as more feminine than masculine. That's the trend, folks. That's not going away. Some of you like it, as I know my Scottish friend does. Some of you may not. That is not going away. Not a chance in hell that is going away.
Hi, Mike here again. I wonder whether Cassie J would be prepared to respond to the suggestion that we go for gender equality rather than men's rights, because I've rather liked your non-confrontational approach. Would you be prepared to respond?
Well, I hate to take up your time here on the stage. I hate to take up Eric's time.
I would be honored for you to take up my time. I want you to know. Yeah. I put off watching The Red Pill until I wrote the book myself. I didn't want to bias myself. And then I watched the movie, and I went, tick, 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 tick. Damn, I want her to do a PhD with me.
Aww.
So it was a fantastic movie.
Well, I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm looking forward to it going online. About gender equality, I remember doing an interview where the subtitle text for the news interview I was doing said, "Woman changes her mind on gender equality." And I thought that was a strange way to put it, because it came off to, you know, most people who have a mainstream perspective about gender issues, it came across like I'm against gender equality now after doing the Red Pill. And of course, that's nowhere near the truth. But yeah, I think it would be useful to start calling yourself a gender equality activist. I know there's a bunch of different titles that MRIs have been trying to try out, so equalist and egalitarian, and for me personally, I've just tried to avoid any labels, because I think labels already have some kind of, depending on who you're talking to, they already have an impression of what that means to them. Yeah. And if you use that label for yourself, it could just be misleading.
I think that the caution I would throw to the community is to gauge where the public reception of any label is. So when the public perception of homosexuality began to be stigmatized by the Christian right in the 1980s, we dumped the label and we moved to gay. You have to be acutely aware of how you are perceived, and that perception will rarely have anything to do with reality.
Okay, I have a couple of comments on what you've said and a couple of questions afterwards. One, the women's movement wouldn't exist as a separate thing if the feminists in the women's movement hadn't stabbed us in the back 150 years ago, and they've been continuing to do that. There is no dealing with these people. They're ideological terrorists.
No, that's extremism, and I do not support your position in any capacity. I have multiple feminist friends who read that entire book and said they agreed with everything in it.
They're not real feminists then?
Yeah, you do not have the right to tell people what their identity label is, just like I can't say you're not straight.
You just did tell us not to change our identity label, though. You said us to stop calling ourselves MOAs.
No, you don't have the right to put your identity label onto people. All I'm suggesting to the community here is that you consider my proposal.
Well,
I will call you whatever you want me to call you.
Regarding your consideration, the feminists have already started attacking egalitarianism as a men's rights activist plot. So changing the labels of all you want, it won't make a difference. They'll still keep attacking you.
If you can show me that empirically, I'll be willing to listen.
It's on YouTube.
No, I'm saying if you can show me that a long-term strategy of changing the label makes matters worse for the outcomes of boys and men in society, then I'd be willing to listen.
History.
But what I am suggesting is that the label has been so tainted, it's prohibiting the good work that many of you are doing.
They'll taint whatever label you want to use.
Right, I got it. You view them as the enemy. Let's move on. I don't expect everybody to agree with me.
Okay.
Sorry, I'll just
hello.
Just two queries. Firstly, just with this specific graph, I think at one stage you conflated sexuality with definition of masculinity. I think you said on the left-hand side of the graph they were less straight. Is that the way that was presented, or did I miss that?
So I can't move to that because I don't have a microphone. But if you ask the same questions, not about their masculinity, but about their sexuality, what you're seeing is a shift, a cohort shift, where the older cohorts stay completely heterosexual, and the younger cohorts are moving towards the center. Well, now, that doesn't mean that their sexual desires are changing. That means that they're viewing they're viewing totally heterosexual as just seeming to be too extreme.
Yeah, but that graph specifically doesn't represent that.
No, this graph is about masculinity only.
Okay.
Yes.
Just to clarify that. And the other
thank you.
I disagree vehemently that words can be violence, but you used very specifically the description of that horrible woman's article about why it's okay to hate men, which was garbage, and it was antagonistic, and it was putrid. But it's not violence, though. But I understand that's a very common perspective in academic.
I call it academic violence.
Okay.
Yeah, and we could have a discussion about what that means, but
I was just looking for your thoughts on that specific definition, whether words can be
I don't want to
violence.
wither down the word violence because I know what it's like to be physically assaulted. I'd prefer to keep it as academic violence.
I'm not denying your lived experience in the slightest, but I think I really admire the talk that you gave today.
Thank you very much. I look forward to having a beer with you later. Just one this time.
Okay.
Your mic didn't work. Yeah.
So I'm wondering a little bit about when you put completely masculine, completely feminine.
Yes.
I think those categories are very challenging in a sense because historically we have been polarizing men into strong, pushy, blah, 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 aggressive and stuff like that. And we have polarized women into caring, loving, considerate.
Yes, absolutely correct.
So I'm just wondering, when young men are not any longer completely over in the masculine, what does it actually mean? What kind of categories have you put up there?
So the category, as I explained before, was completely masculine, mostly masculine, more masculine than feminine.
What does it represent? Because if completely masculine means the old-fashioned polarization of what a man is about, and the other completely feminine means the polarization of feminine.
Yeah.
I'm a psychiatrist. I'm working with people all the time, and the thing is that men have just the same kind of feelings, same kind of caring, same kind of loving, the same kind of things. But like in the 50s, we were not allowed to have it. But is that what you actually categorize as masculine and feminine?
Okay,
that's my question.
I'm not categorizing it, they are. okay? And so what's interesting about this data is however they perceive the question, we can never have control of that in quantitative data on any question ever in the social sciences. But what's interesting about it is however the participants are perceiving it, there is this age cohort difference. But what I do is I back up this research with qualitative data on men, interviews of their lives, and they're rejecting the completely masculine label because, and by the way, I sound aggressive right now, I'm just trying to talk fast. They reject the completely masculine label because they no longer see themselves as violent, as homophobic, as unemotionally intelligible. They no longer see themselves as not being able to cuddle or love or kiss their straight male friends. In fact, they are doing all of those things, and so they're rejecting their father's masculinities, essentially what's happening.
So they're moving closer to become human then?
They are becoming, I would agree with you. I would say, absolutely, I would agree with you. They are becoming human. Yeah. Mike is kicking me off the stadium.
Can we get one last question at the back with Anderson?
We'll talk.